Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be continuing along our journey through the book Eloquent Javascript by Marjan Haverbeek. We're talking about Chapter 8, Bugs and Errors, and today we're going to talk about a section titled Testing. It should be a pretty short video. If you guys remember last time, we talked about types in JS and how JS doesn't really have types as compared to some other languages like Java, but you can bring in types into JS with something like TypeScript, which is a library that allows you to define types that are passed into, like if you're using it in React, define types that are passed into components. So you could say, hey, we have a prop coming in of name, and that name has to be of a type array or a type function, something like that. So there are ways to use it within JS, but JS is normally used the Wild Wild West cowboy way, which is without types, and that's a pretty cool thing and very unique thing for JS. But today we're going to talk about testing. We're going to talk about testing. So if I go to the first slide, exhausting to test sometimes. So starts off this section saying how exhausting it is, how long it could potentially take, and how tedious testing is, especially if the way you test is manually and you do it by running and then rerunning your program every time you make a small little change. So, hey, you make a small little change on the display, right? You run the program, you check it, okay, it's kind of off a little bit, so you stop the program, you change the padding or you change the width, and then you go back, you run it, and then you look at it again. That's not really, and then you just kind of go back and forth, checking back and forth every time, and it can take up a lot of time, and it can be constant. And, there is a way to automate your testing, and what I'm describing there is more UI testing, so a little bit of a different scenario, but maybe if you're testing functionality like, oh, on this button click, I should change the page or something like that. And, if you're manually testing that and going back and forth and debugging it, there might be a better way to do it. So you could go a route of writing automated tests. And this is a concept that we've been talking about in another book series we did and are doing with Clean Code by Bob Martin. If you guys want to check it out, there's a playlist on the book Clean Code, and then currently reading through the book Clean Coder as well. So an automated test, they're a little bit more work to start, but once you complete some functionality, all you have to do is then click a run button and you run a test suite to then verify if the program broke anything and that it's still working properly. If it's broken, you'll notice it immediately without even having to run the program because some of your tests fail. So you know, okay, I got to fix these tests, and then I probably have to write some new tests too if I did introduce some new functionality. So tests are very important, and we talk about this in Clean Code too. They are just little labeled programs is what the author talks about, or how the author describes them. They're little labeled programs that check parts of your code and check to make sure they are doing what they are supposed to be doing. And then we can get into that there's different tests. There's unit tests that test out like functions and methods. There's integration tests and end-to-end tests, which test out the full flow of a particular page, or like the full flow of a particular process in your app. So it's like the whole bigger picture. But here we're kind of talking a little bit more about unit tests and running test suites, which are a collection of tests, maybe in this case unit tests, surrounding a particular feature or functionality of the software. So we do this in my current position where we have test suites for our particular, because we have an app in React, right? So we have a particular test suite that just tests out like a particular component. It'll test out all the different functions and methods within that component and then just make sure that everything's working properly. So a test suite is just that. It's a collection of tests surrounding a particular feature or functionality of that software, and all the tests are kind of have that thing in common if they're part of that test suite. But there's also test runners. There's also test runners, which are functionality, or not functionality, but they are a program. But they're a way to, how about this? They're a way to automate the execution of tests within a suite. I was trying to say if it was a program, and I mean, I guess it might be, but test runners are just a way to execute all the tests. And what test runners do is that in addition to running all the tests, they'll run them in parallel. They'll evaluate the results. They'll evaluate the assertion statements. They'll generate reports. They'll generate logging so that you can see outputs of the tests and if the test passed or failed. So those are test runners. A very common test runner, as well as test suite, is Jest in specifically front end. If we're talking about JavaScript and React, I use Jest a lot. I guess if you're talking about back end and Java, you have JUnit, I think would be an example of a test suite. You would have a TestNG, I think, is another one as well. But in here, we're talking about Jest, and this is kind of how it looks on the right there. So the code on the right is your test suite, your testing file, and it's testing this function. And you can see how this is structured. You have a describe statement, a describe function, and then within that describe function, you have different test scenarios. So this has 4 tests within the describe, and you can have multiple describes within your testing file, and they're kind of like the topic of the test. So in this case, we have addition. So function add, we're going to test addition. All right, so we have different tests that tests addition. So we're going to test if it adds 2 numbers, if it adds negative numbers, if it adds numbers as strings, if it handles 0 well. So you can maybe then have another describe, which is, I don't know, subtraction, maybe even hell, because, if you add 2 negative numbers, well, then your number should be lower. I don't know what another describe would be. Maybe addition. Maybe you can extrapolate this to addition, single digit addition, and then multi-digit addition. But all that to say, that is how a test suite looks like. A very basic test suite looks like in Jest. And again, it's a very common testing framework for JavaScript, developed by Facebook. React was also, I believe, developed by Facebook as well. Oh, and I'm sorry, that got a little cut off. Yeah, okay, it says also a runner. Sorry about that, guys. That got a little cut off. But Jest is not only a test suite, but it's also a test runner. So it'll run your tests in parallel, and it will evaluate the results for you. Last slide, guys. There is something as test-driven development. There is such a thing. And if you've watched the clean code videos, you'll know that I've talked about test-driven development. This was something that Uncle Bob Martin talks about in his books in Clean Code and Clean Coder. And Mergen doesn't bring it up in the book, but I wanted to bring it up here, that this is essentially where you write the tests before you write the production code, which is something that actually we don't really do at my company, but maybe it would provide a lot of value. Typically, how I work is I'll write the code first and then write the test. But actually, if you do apply TDD, test-driven development, it could lead to better coverage of your code, and also it could be more structurally sound. So there's 3 laws of TDD, and the first law is you can't write production code until you write a failing test. Cool, so you write a failing test, right? What is a failing test? You don't write more of a unit test than is sufficient to fail or not compile, and not compiling is failing, is what Uncle Bob says. So once you write a little bit of the test, you run it, and it fails. You stop. Then you go to your production code, and you get the test just barely passing. You don't want to write anything more then the code's sufficient to make your test pass. So this could be something super simple, like your test could instantiate a class. You run it, it fails because you haven't created that class yet. And then you go to your files, your directories, and you create that class. Stop right there, go back to the test. Okay, the class, we're going to be testing a getter. So you write your assertion statement that a get something should return 3, run it, it fails. So then you go back to your class that you just made and you create your getters. You don't create your setters, you just create the getter, that test is testing. And you guys can see the repetition and the going back and forth. Is it tedious? Maybe. I've only used it minimally in my career, but I think Uncle Bob's would say that it provides a lot of value. It could lead to better coverage of your code. It could lead your code to be more architecturally and structurally sound. You can apply more clean code principles this way. So it could provide a lot of value, and I just wanted to put it here for you guys. And there are videos. I have done some videos on TDD. I think at least one recently from the book Clean Coder. So if you guys wanted to know more about that. But that's going to do it, guys. That was it for this video. We'll be back next time. No video next week. Or maybe. We'll see. I might be able to get a video out next week. I'll be traveling, so we'll see on that. But I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.